Hello, travelers. It's been a long day for you already. You can now rest here. Listen to funny histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why it sucked to be a World War II factory worker, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this. And hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The good news, you're helping defeat fascism. The bad news, you'll probably lose your hearing, grow an extra callus on your soul, and spend most of your day inhaling things that even rats refuse to breathe. Welcome to your new job on the home front, the World War II factory floor, where the air smells like hot metal, the machines scream louder than your in-laws, and your boss thinks a break is something you do to a bone. It's the 1940s. Hitler's storming across Europe. Japan has just bombed Pearl Harbor, and Uncle Sam is pointing directly at you in every poster. Except this time, instead of shipping off to the front lines, you're drafted into a new kind of battle. Production. Steel, rubber, aluminum, gunpowder, everything the military needs, and you're the lucky soul chosen to make it. Don't worry if you've never seen a rivet gun before. Neither has anyone else. You'll be trained with a pamphlet, a prayer, and a supervisor named Earl, who thinks PPE is just a weird way to spell PP. You walk in your first day, and it hits you. Not ambition, not pride, not even purpose, just the smell. A steaming cocktail of sweat, oil, metal shavings, and whatever Frank had for lunch last week. That's still lingering by the furnace. Machines thump and roar like they're trying to warn you not to get too close, which you won't listen to until your shirt sleeve gets caught in a gear. Congrats. You're now both a patriot and a human pulley system. Everywhere you look, there's action. Men and women, mostly women by this point, loading shells, welding frames, and hammering metal like they're mad at it. Because they are. This is a place where coffee break means standing still for 90 seconds while holding a cup that tastes like hot regrets and pencil shavings. And then there's the uniform. Not crisp, not flattering, just beige, itchy, and somehow both too tight and too loose at the same time. You wear a kerchief or cap to keep your hair safe. Safe from being swallowed by a belt drive. A look that says, I'm not here for fashion. I'm here to survive Tuesday. You didn't choose this life. This life chose you, because men were off fighting, and factories still needed hands. So here you are, Rosie, or Rob, riveting for victory, and hoping the victory comes before your spine gives out. Oh, and did I mention the noise? Imagine a jackhammer, a chainsaw, a banshee, and 3 arguing jazz bands shoved into a metal trash can. Then imagine that for 12 hours a day, congratulations, you've made it past orientation, which consisted of someone shouting "Don't touch that" 3 times and handing you a wrench the size of your forearm. You're officially a wartime factory worker now. Hero of the home front, soldier of steel, casualty of chronic back pain. Your job depends on the day. 1 minute you're riveting aeroplane wings. The next you're pouring molten metal into a mold with nothing but a pair of tongs and a look of mild regret. Think of it as industrial roulette. Every day is a surprise, and every surprise could lead to 3rd-degree burns. Let's start with safety. Or, more accurately, the complete absence of it. OSHA? Never heard of her. Protective gear? Optional. And by optional we mean you can borrow some if no one else is using it. And it still fits after Dave melted the fingers off. Factories were dangerous playgrounds of moving parts, steam vents, sparks, and gigantic machines that seemed to run on coal, human misery, and barely contained violence. You were surrounded by belts, gears, presses, and conveyor systems designed to turn raw materials into tanks, and co-workers into cautionary tales. If you were lucky, you only got minor injuries, smashed fingers, strained backs, burns or deafness in one ear. If you were unlucky, well, let's just say wartime factories had a way of separating people from their limbs faster than government paperwork could process your next of kin letter. And what about ventilation? Let's not kid ourselves. These factories had all the air circulation of a sealed tomb. The windows didn't open or didn't exist. The ceiling fans squeaked like they were powered by dying mice, and the air was thick with the fragrant aroma of carbon monoxide, industrial lubricants, and whatever was evaporating off Carl's overalls. You didn't just sweat, you steamed. On hot days, the factory became a metal oven. On cold days, it just froze your hope. Either way, the climate could be described as character building and mildly apocalyptic. Now let's talk about training. Were you given a multi-day seminar with detailed manuals and helpful demonstrations? Of course not. You were given a machine, a vague description of what it does, and the words "you'll figure it out." And if you didn't, the machine would figure you out by eating your glove, your hand, and possibly your will to live. Need to weld? Here's a mask with a cracked lens. Need to lift 80-pound engine blocks? Here's your back, and possibly a hernia. Need to work the stamping press? Good luck. That thing has crushed more hopes than your ex during a breakup. If you were a woman entering the factory for the first time, perhaps having never worked outside the home before, your training often involved a supervisor yelling over the noise. It's just like using a rolling pin, but with explosives. Spoiler alert, it was not, but you pushed through it. Because every plane you helped build, every shell you packed, every engine you assembled, it mattered. You weren't just making things, you were making history. Just, history that might throw sparks in your face if you leaned too close. Oh, and did I mention the hours? You thought the 9 to 5 was rough? Try the wartime shift system, swing shifts, graveyard shifts, rotating shifts. Whatever it took to keep the machines running 24/7. Your body clock, obliterated. You measured time not by sunrise or meals, but by when the whistle blew and when your knees stopped screaming. And let's not forget the fatigue, not the "I stayed up too late watching movies" kind. This was the "my bones are whispering threats to me" kind. You'd work yourself into a daze so deep that people forgot their own names mid-weld. One moment you're at your station, the next you've nodded off, leaning against a pallet of tank parts, dreaming of a vacation that will never come. But hey, at least you didn't have to dodge bullets. Just falling anvils, boiling vats, spinning belts, molten metal, and sharp tools stored in the dumbest places possible. So yes, your glorious new job might kill you. But until it does, there's more riveting to do. And no, that's not a metaphor. You are literally riveting things. Again, and again, and again. If you thought your job sucked today because the Wi-Fi was slow and someone stole your yogurt from the break room, allow me to introduce you to the World War II factory workers' schedule, where the only thing that runs faster than the assembly line is your will to escape it. 12-hour shifts, sometimes more, 6 days a week, occasionally 7 because weekends are for the weak, and Hitler doesn't take Sundays off. You didn't just work, you surrendered your existence to the factory whistle, which blew so loud, and so often, it might as well have been your alarm clock, lunch bell, and Grim Reaper rolled into one. And that whistle? Oh, it didn't signal end of shift, so much as temporary pause before you come crawling back with less soul and slightly more metal dust in your lungs. Each day began with the sacred ritual of dragging your exhausted body out of bed, shoveling something breakfast adjacent into your mouth, usually powdered eggs and desperation, and stumbling into a factory that felt less like a workplace and more like an industrial fever dream. Coffee was your best friend, assuming you could find any. Wartime rationing turned caffeine into a luxury. Real coffee? Forget it. You were probably drinking some kind of chicory root potion that tasted like burnt optimism and cardboard. It didn't wake you up. It just gave you the energy to feel angry while you were unconscious on your feet. Lunch breaks? Technically they existed, but don't expect a quaint little picnic. You got maybe 20 minutes in a corner, filled with smoke, grease, and the sounds of someone trying to open a can of beans with a wrench. You'd sit on a pile of scrap metal, gnawing at a spam sandwich that had the texture of regret and the flavor profile of salty rubber tire. Tired? That's not a feeling anymore. It's a personality trait. You were so used to exhaustion that being alert felt suspicious. You'd blink, and 3 hours would pass. Sometimes you'd hallucinate your supervisor morphing into a hot dog. No one judged. They were seeing it too. As for bathroom breaks, they were negotiable. You'd hold it, longer than a hostage situation. Why? Because leaving your post meant slowing production, which meant glares from your co-workers, a lecture from your supervisor, and possibly a sternly worded poster featuring Uncle Sam looking disappointed in you, and nobody wanted that. Then there were the night shifts. Ah yes, the graveyard shift, named not just for the time of day, but for how your body felt during it. Working overnight messed with your sleep, your mood, your digestion, and your basic understanding of what day it was. After a while, you stopped keeping track. Tuesday? Friday? Wartime? All days blurred into one long conveyor belt of noise and sweat, and the rhythmic thunk of some machine you no longer feared, but had come to regard as your only real companion. Let's also not forget the morale-boosting tactics. Management tried to keep spirits up with things like factory newsletters, patriotic slogans, and motivational signs that said things like "your work is their weapon" or "Hitler hates slackers," which sure is inspiring, until you realize you've been welding parts for 7 hours straight and can no longer feel your thumbs. And oh, how glamorous the post-shift life was. You'd shuffle home like a zombie in overalls, covered in grime and smelling like a combination of axle grease and existential dread. You'd collapse into bed only to dream of gears turning, hammers pounding, and your own alarm clock mocking you with a smirk. But here's the kicker. People still showed up, day after day, not because it was easy, not because it was fun, but because they knew every tank, every bullet, every engine they helped build could mean one less soldier dying overseas. That was the trade-off. Your time, your body, your comfort, for the hope that this nightmare would end, and your real life could begin again. And so the glamour of 12-hour shifts wasn't really glamorous at all, but it was historic. You weren't just clocking in, you were holding the entire war machine together with one blistered hand and a can of fake coffee. Ah, home sweet home. That magical place where you kick off your shoes, relax in a hot bath, and unwind from a long day of factory work. Just kidding. You don't unwind. You collapse. And if you're lucky, you make it to the bed before gravity finishes the job for you. See, home life during World War II wasn't really life. It was more like an unpaid second shift. You stagger through the door, smelling like an oil spill, married a campfire, only to be greeted by hungry kids, a stack of ration coupons, and a stove that refuses to light unless you threaten it. Let's start with housing. Wartime housing shortages meant entire families were crammed into spaces smaller than modern studio apartments. Your bedroom was probably a corner partitioned off with a curtain. Your closet was a nail in the wall, and your privacy was a concept you'd read about once in a magazine, right next to an ad for powdered milk. In war-boom towns, things were even worse. Some families rented chicken coops, some lived in tents, some lived in factories. That's right, your workday didn't end at the factory, because for some, it doubled as their zip code. Sleeping at work wasn't a productivity hack, it was an unfortunate necessity. And speaking of food, yes, technically you ate at home, but thanks to rationing, your diet was about as exciting as a wet cardboard sandwich. Sugar, butter, coffee, meat, and canned goods were all strictly limited. You became a culinary wizard out of desperation, stretching meals with powdered eggs, bulking out meatloaf with oats and wishful thinking, and pretending margarine didn't taste like sadness spread on toast. And don't even think about wasting food. If you dropped a potato on the floor, you picked it up, kissed it better, and served it with a side of dignity. Food was sacred. People developed actual recipes for things like mock apple pie made from Ritz crackers and delusion. Your clothes, threadbare but patriotic. New outfits were a distant dream. You patched holes, darned socks, and if something tore in a weird place, congratulations, it was now a fashion statement. One pair of work pants might last you the entire war, mostly out of spite. And laundry? You ever try scrubbing grease-soaked overalls by hand after a 12-hour shift? That wasn't doing laundry. That was a full contact sport. You beat your clothes against a washboard until either the dirt or your will to live gave out. Then there was childcare. Wartime daycare was a luxury most couldn't afford or didn't have access to, so kids had to become miniature adults. If they weren't at school, they were running errands, babysitting younger siblings, or doing household chores with the steely focus of a tiny sergeant. Some factories had on-site nurseries, but many didn't, so parents did what they could. You haven't known chaos until you've tried to explain to a toddler that they cannot ride the forklift again. And let's talk about leisure, because yes, even World War II factory workers needed a break. What did relaxation look like? Reading a newspaper while your feet soak in a basin, playing cards while half asleep, listening to the radio and praying for good news. And occasionally, if you had a few cents to spare and a friend to drag with you, a trip to the local movie theatre to watch propaganda reels and pretend popcorn didn't cost more than your self-esteem. Of course, that's assuming you weren't one of the millions participating in scrap drives, victory gardens, or sewing circles to support the troops. Even in your free time, you were working for the war effort, for the neighborhood, or simply to keep your household from falling into the kind of disarray that gets you written about in local gossip. Oh, and don't forget the blackouts. At any moment, city alarms could blare and plunge your home into darkness. Curtains had to be tightly shut, lights off, and everyone still, waiting in the silence, and hoping tonight wasn't the night an air raid visited your neighborhood. It's hard to enjoy a game of checkers when you're doing it by candlelight, and low-key panicking about enemy bombers. So home life, yes, technically it existed, but it was more like a survival side quest, a daily exercise in endurance, improvisation, and trying not to scream into your mashed potatoes. Still, people carried on. They made do. They got married, had babies, wrote letters, told jokes, sang songs, and tried to squeeze moments of joy out of a world that seemed determined to test their limits. Because even when the world was falling apart, the dishes still needed doing. Now, if you thought the factory floor was rough, wait till you see the social side of things. Because, as much as World War II was about defeating fascism abroad, it didn't exactly squash discrimination back home. The factory may have been churning out tanks and bombers, but it was also a full-time production of gender bias, racism, and awkward tension breaks at the water cooler. Let's start with the obvious, gender dynamics. Before the war, factories were largely male spaces, loud, dirty, dangerous, and filled with men yelling at each other over the sound of machinery. But when millions of men were shipped off to Europe and the Pacific, the labor gap had to be filled. Enter Rosie the Riveter, America's favorite propaganda poster, and probably the first woman to make flexing in a bandana look iconic. The government launched a PR campaign with more sparkle than a Broadway musical. "You can do it, ladies," the posters said. "Join the workforce. Be a hero." What they didn't mention was, and also make 40% less than your male co-workers while doing the same job with a smile. See, Rosie may have riveted, but she also got patronized. Women were suddenly capable of running complex machinery, but somehow still not qualified to supervise, make decisions, or use the good bathroom. And don't even think about getting pregnant. Maternity leave was less of a benefit, and more of a polite invitation to get fired. Supervisors often assumed women didn't know the difference between a wrench and a ladle, and some male co-workers made it their mission to correct them, by which we mean hover, mansplain, and occasionally drop tools near their feet to test their reflexes. Also, the uniforms, a fashion statement made entirely out of denim, sweat, and institutional sexism. Women were required to wear pants, gasp, which was scandalous in some circles. One local headline might as well have read, "Breaking, women now have legs." But don't worry, if you were a white woman, you were mildly resented. If you were a black woman, you were barely tolerated. Race and discrimination in wartime factories was the plot twist. Nobody wanted, but everyone expected. The push to fill jobs opened some doors for African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans. But let's be clear, those doors were heavily guarded by signs that read, "Don't get too comfortable." In many factories, black workers were segregated to the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs, cleaning foundries, hauling molten metal, working with chemicals that came with a free side of lung damage. They were often excluded from union meetings, lunch tables, or even drinking fountains, and if they spoke up, suddenly there was no more room on the schedule. And God help you if you tried to apply for a skilled position. There were supervisors who looked at your resume, then looked at your face, and suddenly forgot how to read. For Japanese Americans, things were even worse. Many had been forcibly relocated to internment camps. You know, just a quick constitutional vacation, where your rights were stored in a box, marked maybe later. Even those outside the camps often lost jobs, homes, and community standing overnight, because nothing says land of the free like judging you for your last name. Mexican Americans were heavily recruited through the Bracero program to help with agricultural labor, but those who ended up in industrial work often found themselves the targets of open hostility, wage theft, and the ever-present suspicion that they weren't real Americans. Because nothing builds team morale like vague nationalism and xenophobia. Workplace discrimination wasn't subtle. It was written into hiring policies, union bylaws, and the grimace on your boss's face when you walked in. Even the government's own propaganda sometimes portrayed minorities in racist caricatures, while asking them to donate scrap metal for freedom. But despite all this, people kept showing up. They endured the slurs, the smirks, and the accidental wrench tosses. They worked twice as hard for half the credit, knowing full well that victory in the war wouldn't mean equality back home. But it might mean the possibility of it, someday. There were small rebellions, women who organized, black workers who unionized, Latino laborers who walked out in protest. These weren't just war workers, they were quiet revolutionaries, setting the groundwork for the civil rights movements and feminist battles that would explode in the decades to come. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest irony of all. The war made America promise things it had never truly delivered: equality, justice, opportunity for all. And while factories were supposed to be the great equalizers, they often just reinforced the pecking order with extra noise. Still, in that grimy, grinding, gear-turning mess, the seeds of change were being welded into place, because nothing forces a country to confront its contradictions, quite like asking someone to die for freedoms they don't even get to enjoy at home. Let's talk about injuries, accidents, and the daily peril of having limbs. Welcome to your average day on the World War II factory floor, a place where every machine is bigger than you, louder than your thoughts, and seems personally offended by your presence. And if you've brought along your limbs today, bold choice. Because here's the thing, World War II factories weren't exactly designed with OSHA compliance in mind. In fact, OSHA wouldn't even exist until 1970. So until then, safety protocols consisted of 3 basic rules. 1. Don't look directly at the sparks. 2. Don't scream unless it's urgent. 3. Try to keep the same number of fingers you started with. Working in a wartime factory was like joining a high-stakes game of Will It Maim Me. Industrial accidents were so common, they might as well have had their own punch card system. Your 10th injury is free. Congrats, you get a bandage. Let's start with the machines. These things were massive, unforgiving, and operated by people on their 5th hour of sleep and 3rd cup of hope. Giant mechanical presses, lathes, stamping machines, and welders, all of them hungry, all of them just one distraction away from turning you into a cautionary tale. You know what happened when someone dropped a wrench into the gears? Nothing good. And you know how you learnt about proper machine operation? By watching someone else get hurt first. It was less training and more natural selection with uniforms. Protective gear, if it existed, it was usually one size fits none. Safety goggles were cloudy, gloves were optional, and steel-toed boots were a fantasy you read about in union newsletters. Most workers wore whatever they had: canvas overalls, leather aprons, a little bit of faith, and hoped the sparks didn't hit their socks. Let's talk injuries. Burns, welding torches, molten metal, friction from machinery. If it could burn, it probably did. Some people got so used to minor burns, they referred to them like weather. Oof, caught a light scorch on the left hand today. Gonna be a warm one. One moment you're feeding sheet metal into a press. The next you're calling your digits by their new names. Shorty and regret. Chemical exposure. Factories were full of fun mystery substances, with names like Solvent Blend 47, and don't inhale that. Ventilation. Open a window if you can find one. Bonus points if your factory even had windows. Hearing loss. Hearing loss, ear protection was for cowards. Or rather, it didn't exist yet. You went deaf by the decade. The constant pounding, clanging, grinding, and shrieking of metal on metal wasn't just background noise. It was the unofficial factory anthem. Falls, greasy floors, ladders with attitude problems, and catwalks with no rails meant gravity was always just waiting for its moment to shine. Now here's the real kicker. If you got injured, you didn't necessarily go home. Nope, injury was just part of the job. Bandage it up, grit your teeth, and get back to work. Champ. Some workers were so determined, or just so financially desperate, they'd return to the floor with broken bones, stitched wounds, or missing fingers still bleeding through their gloves. There were even disabled workers who kept going because there was no safety net, no paid leave, no disability insurance worth mentioning. If you lost a limb, you didn't just lose functionality, you lost your livelihood. So you adapted. You became the one-handed welder, or the peg-legged foreman. You earned street cred, just for surviving the conveyor belt long enough to limp out the other side. And if you died on the job, well, that was tragic. But production still had quotas. Your workstation would be cleaned, swept, and reassigned before your obituary hit the paper. Factories had no time for mourning. They barely had time for lunch. Even so, accidents weren't always taken seriously. If something blew up or a machine malfunctioned, management might call it a hiccup or a brief incident. Never an avoidable disaster, even if the walls were still smoldering and Larry was missing half an eyebrow. Some companies tried to promote safety, usually through colorful posters showing smiling workers not being on fire. But these were about as effective as putting up a sign that said, "Please don't be maimed." Still, through all the noise, the danger, and the constant threat of becoming part of the machinery, people kept showing up because they had to, because rent didn't care about your bruises, because patriotism sometimes looked like welding airplane parts with blistered hands and a stiff upper lip. They laughed. They limped. They swapped horror stories over burnt coffee, and they lived with the constant awareness that every shift might be their last with all their parts intact. So yes, having limbs in a World War II factory was a luxury. Keeping them, that was the miracle. At last, the factory whistle blows. It's a sound that's supposed to signal relief, victory, freedom, the long-awaited end of your shift. Except, it doesn't feel like any of those things. Not really. Because when that shrieking metal banshee goes off, all it really means is, congratulations. You survived another day. Try not to collapse in the parking lot. You'd think clocking out after 10 or 12 hours of high-stakes machinery wrestling would come with confetti, applause, maybe a back massage and a medal. But no, what you actually get is a slow shuffle out the door, with several hundred other exhausted humans, all of you moving like extras in a zombie movie, where the only craving is sleep, and maybe a potato. And just to be clear, this was not an 8-hour workday. Wartime factories ran 24/7s, and the idea of overtime was less optional bonus pay, and more, you're doing it because the war depends on you, comrade. Sometimes you didn't even know when your shift ended. You just noticed the calendar had changed. Once the whistle blew, workers didn't skip into the sunset. They limped, hobbled, and dragged their sorry bones toward home, praying for dinner, a bath, and a moment to stare blankly at a wall without someone yelling, "More rivets." But here's the twist. The day wasn't really over. If you were a woman, congrats. You had the second shift waiting at home, children to feed, laundry to do, a house to maintain, maybe an elderly relative to bathe, and exactly 0 people to thank you for it. Dinner was something canned, reheated, or surrendered to entirely. And if you lived in a wartime city, good luck getting any rest. Cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles weren't just buzzing with industry. They were absolutely overloaded. Imagine an entire town chugging coffee, screaming over engines, and hosting blackouts at the same time. Housing shortages were so bad that people rented out basements, closets, tool sheds, basically anything with a roof and questionable plumbing. You might have shared a room with 3 strangers and a mattress that squeaked like it was trying to confess to a crime. Privacy? That was a peacetime luxury. Noise pollution was constant. Sirens, trucks, rail cars, the occasional air raid drill just for kicks. If you were lucky, you'd get 5 hours of broken sleep and a dream that didn't involve anvils falling on your head. But usually, sleep was more of a suggestion, a mythical event that happened to other people. And speaking of air raid drills, yeah, those happened too. Sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes while you were halfway through a tin of beans. You'd have to douse the lights, hide in your designated blackout zone, and wait while the silence stretched out like a warning. Because even though the factories were on the home front, they still felt like a target. And in coastal areas especially, workers lived with the low-level fear that one day the sirens wouldn't be practice. That one day, they'd have to fight a war in their own streets. Blackout curtains weren't just decor, they were mandatory. Lights out at night meant safety. A single candle in a window could bring a fine, or worse. And so you learned to live in the dark, literally. And then, just as your body finally started to melt into the lumpy mattress and your ears stopped ringing from the symphony of metal and exhaustion, the alarm clock screeched. Morning already. Time to do it all again. And again. And again. Because the war didn't take weekends. And neither did your boss. Even on days off, if you had one, you were expected to be productive. Tend a victory garden. Collect scrap metal. Attend a rationing seminar. Knit socks for the troops. If you so much as sat still for longer than an hour, you were probably committing some kind of patriotic crime. There was an unspoken pressure to constantly do more, be useful, be strong, be the reason America wins. It didn't matter if your back hurt or your feet were swollen or you hadn't seen your spouse in 3 weeks. You were part of the war machine now, and it didn't run on naps and empathy. And yet, people did it, somehow. Despite the exhaustion, the danger, the double shifts and triple jobs, the blisters and burns and blackout drills, they showed up, again and again, because even though the job sucked, and oh boy, it sucked like a Hoover on turbo, there was a bigger picture, a war to win, lives on the line. They kept going, even when it felt like the whistle was less of a signal and more of a threat, because in the factory towns of World War II, clocking out didn't mean you were done. It just meant you were still alive. Wartime romance. Hollywood would have you believe that working in a World War II factory was just a smoky, slow-motion love story waiting to happen. 2 tired souls reach for the same rivet, their eyes meet over the engine block, and boom, true love blossoms between the welding sparks and the scent of hot oil. Reality? Less Casablanca, more accidental elbow to the face, followed by a shared cigarette and mutual disappointment. Let's be clear, romance did happen in factories. After all, you had hundreds, sometimes thousands of people crammed into the same industrial space day after day, all wearing variations of coveralls and slowly losing their grip on personal hygiene. What could be more romantic? But the truth is, most factory love looked more like sweaty proximity than sweeping drama. The conditions weren't exactly seductive: grease-covered hands, soot-smudged faces, and breath that screamed, "I've been inhaling metal filings since 6 a.m. This was the courtship vibe. You want to flirt with the welder from Station 3? Great, just shout sweet nothings over the grinding noise of a hydraulic press, and hope your attempt at charm doesn't get drowned out by someone screaming because they stepped on a hot rivet. And even if you did manage to spark a connection, privacy was a myth. You were always surrounded by co-workers, supervisors, and the occasional wandering pigeon who somehow got inside the building and was now silently judging your choices. Romantic gestures had to be subtle: a smuggled chocolate from a ration card, a note passed between shifts. Maybe you offered your last cough drop as a sign of eternal devotion. Nothing said "I love you" like peppermint and shared exhaustion, but relationships faced challenges. First off, factory romances were not always welcome, especially from management's perspective. Love could mean distraction, distraction meant injury, injury meant bad press, so companies often tried to enforce anti-fraternization rules, which worked about as well as telling people not to breathe. And while we're at it, let's talk about jealousy. Oh, it thrived. If someone started spending too much time by a particular workstation, people noticed. Whisper networks in factories ran faster than the conveyor belts. You'd think spies were passing state secrets, but no. It was just everyone gossiping about whether Rosie and Reggie were a thing now. But not all love was innocent. There were complications, like the fact that many men were already married when they met someone new on the factory floor. Wartime separation led to lonely hearts, and lonely hearts sometimes led to very awkward homecomings. Also, power dynamics were a very real issue. Male supervisors overseeing mostly female workers meant some relationships weren't exactly mutual admiration, so much as "this man controls my schedule, and I need this job." Romance could turn uncomfortable or exploitative real quick. Still, amidst the grime, noise, and questionable decisions, there were genuine connections. People got married, they raised kids. Some even looked back at the factory years as the time they met the one, covered in grime and yelling over steam-powered drills. And honestly, that kind of love, that's real. The kind where you both come home too tired to talk, but still find time to split a can of beans and laugh about the guy who got stuck in the lathe. Don't worry, he's mostly fine now. Because wartime factory love wasn't about roses and candlelight. It was about companionship in chaos. 2 people finding each other in a world turned upside down, in a building that smelled like hot steel and overcooked coffee. So yes, the romance myth isn't completely wrong, just less glamorous, and more likely to involve a first kiss in a supply closet, while someone outside yells, "Hey, break's over, let's talk about factory food," because nothing says, "Thank you for giving your youth to the war effort," like a steaming plate of beige. That's right. Welcome to the factory cafeteria, where the meat is mysterious, the vegetables are mushy, and hope is not on the menu. First of all, calling it a cafeteria might be generous. In some places, It was more of a concrete bunker with folding tables, a soup vat, and a woman named Dolores who had seen too much. Her ladle dripped with equal parts gravy and disdain. Now, you'd think a nation fighting a global war would at least feed its workers. Something hearty, something energizing, something edible. But no, food during WWY was a delicate dance of rationing, shortages, and culinary war crimes. Fresh meat? Good luck. That was being shipped to the front lines. Same with eggs, butter, sugar, coffee, and basically everything that made life worth living. What remained for the factory cafeteria was a medley of meat substitutes, which is a nice way of saying whatever was left over when optimism died. You might get spam on toast, if someone remembered to toast the bread and not just wave it near a warm pipe, or creamed chipped beef, which looked like something scraped off a battlefield and tasted like regret on white sauce. The nickname for it? SOS, short for stuff on a shingle. We'll let you guess what the S really stood for. Vegetables weren't vegetables. They were memories of vegetables, boiled into oblivion, colorless, textureless, flavorless, just hot mush that somehow tasted like both cabbage and despair, regardless of what it actually was. Dessert? If you were lucky, you'd get a victory cake, made without eggs or butter, sweetened with whatever the baker could find, sometimes molasses, sometimes desperation. It was dry, crumbly, and as sweet as a cold handshake. But it was technically cake, and in wartime, technically was good enough. Now, don't think you could just skip the cafeteria and bring food from home. Lunchboxes weren't better. They were usually packed with the same rations, plus maybe a pickle and a sandwich made of yesterday's hope. Leftovers maybe, or that same sad bologna that had been sweating in your tin lunch pail since 5 a.m. The real tragedy? The coffee. It was not coffee. It was hot, bitter water that had been introduced to a coffee bean once in 1937. Sometimes it was made from roasted barley or chicory. Yes, the stuff you find in a garden. It didn't wake you up so much as confuse your body into alertness. And don't forget, you didn't have much time to eat. You had 15, maybe 20 minutes. Max, long enough to burn your mouth on soup, drop your sandwich in your lap, and maybe hear one juicy piece of factory gossip before someone shouted, "Back to the line," and the line didn't wait for digestion. No, you went back to work while your stomach staged a protest. Heavy machinery and indigestion are not a fun pairing, by the way. Nothing quite like assembling an engine block while burping up mystery stew and wondering if this is how your story ends. Also, no snacks. This wasn't a place where you could sneak a protein bar between tasks. If you wanted to nibble, you'd better be okay with chewing on pencil stubs or dreams. The government encouraged balanced meals, but what that meant was unclear when the only fruit you saw all month was a bruised wartime banana, which, for some reason, tasted like sadness and cardboard. Oh, and don't get sick, because factory medicine had about 2 solutions for food poisoning. 1, lie down on a cot for 10 minutes. Or 2, go back to work and try not to vomit into the assembly line. Medical staff were often minimal, and unless you were unconscious or visibly on fire, you were expected to power through. But here's the wild part. People adapted. They joked about the food, traded recipes to make rationed meals better, and even brought in home-baked treats to share. A dry muffin shared with greasy hands and a smile. That was community. So yes, factory food was a tragedy on a tray, but it was also fuel. Barely, kind of. In a please don't ask what's in this sort of way. And if you were lucky, you got to eat it sitting down. So you landed your job in the factory. Congratulations. You're earning a paycheck and doing your part for the war effort. But hold on, before you start dreaming about that new hat or a box of chocolates. Let's talk about your wartime wallet. Spoiler alert, it's complicated. First up, money was tight. Even if you worked full-time grinding, welding, or assembling parts like a machine yourself. Inflation was sneaky, prices for everyday goods went up, and shortages meant that cash alone couldn't buy you much. Sure, you might be earning more than before, but that didn't mean your buying power was suddenly the envy of Wall Street. Why? Because rationing was the law of the land. Imagine trying to buy socks when the government's rationing system says you get 3 coupons a month, and the sock store just sold out last Tuesday. Your paycheck might say plenty, but your ration book says, nope. Yes, ration books were a weird mix of magic and misery. They were little booklets filled with coupons that allowed you to buy limited amounts of essential goods like sugar, meat, butter, and yes, socks. Without the coupons, You were stuck staring longingly at shop shelves like a hungry dog outside a butcher's shop. But here's the kicker. Rationing didn't make life fair, just interesting. Some people were lucky, others struggled. There was a thriving underground economy, where ration coupons could be traded like gold bars. Trading 2 sugar coupons for 1 luxury coffee coupon. A solid deal if you liked bitter beverages and shady deals. And socks. Don't get me started on socks. Even with coupons, socks were scarce. You'd be lucky if your socks didn't develop holes halfway through the day. And then the inevitable moment when you'd patch them up with thread that looked like it had survived a minor war itself. So why were socks such a big deal? Because war boots were not known for their comfort. They were heavy, stiff, and about as breathable as a plastic bag on a summer day. Worn without decent socks, your feet became a battlefield all their own. Blisters, fungus, and mysterious smells that could clear a room faster than an air raid siren. Now, you might wonder, if money and ration coupons were limited, how did people even survive? Well, ingenuity was the secret weapon. Women and men turned to mending, recycling, and creative thrift like champions of DIY before it was cool. Sweaters were unraveled and reknit. Old uniforms transformed into new clothes. And if you were really desperate, you learned to love homemade remedies for sock holes, like safety pins and patches made from old curtains. Plus, factory workers had to balance their wartime expenses with supporting families at home, sending money back to relatives, and sometimes even saving up for the war bond craze, which was basically the government's way of saying, trust us, your money is helping win the war, eventually. And speaking of money, don't expect a raise just for risking your life. Pay rates were often fixed by the government to prevent inflation and keep the economy stable, so grinding your fingers off on the assembly line wouldn't necessarily mean a bigger paycheck at the end of the month. In fact, many factory workers joked that their wallets were lighter than their steel helmets, and that their money did the disappearing act better than Houdini. But despite the tight budgets, rationing, and worn-out socks, factory workers kept going, because their wallets might have been lean, but their spirits, well, those were priceless. You're part of the greatest show on earth, the war effort. Your hands are building planes, tanks, and weapons that will help defeat the enemy and bring freedom to the world. Cue the soaring music, the slow-motion salutes, and the parade of flags. But hold your horses. Before you start imagining yourself as a heroic super soldier with a wrench, let's unpack what helping the war effort really meant when you were stuck in the factory trenches. First off, patriotism was everywhere. Posters screamed, "We can do it," and loose lips sink ships. Your workplace was decked out in red, white, and blue, and someone was always giving a speech about how your sweat and grime were making history. You felt proud, and you should have. The whole country depended on the factories. Your work was crucial. Without your late-night welding or tireless riveting, the troops on the front would be stuck using sticks and stones. But here's the twist. Patriotism was often used to keep you working harder, longer, and with fewer complaints. Bosses weren't just managers. They were unofficial motivational speakers. They reminded you every 5 minutes that you were fighting the good fight, through assembly line speed, through grueling hours, through that aching back you didn't know you had. Complaining, that was almost unpatriotic. You don't love your country if you whine about your shift. So you smiled through the noise, the heat, and the headaches. Meanwhile, the reality was rough. You weren't on the battlefield, but the factory was its own kind of war zone, with dangers just as real. Toxic fumes, dangerous machinery, exhaustion, and injuries waiting around every corner. Yet the public, and even some supervisors, often viewed you as the home front hero, a label heavy with expectation and light on sympathy. And then there was the propaganda. Newsreels and newspapers loved to show women and men in their coveralls, looking victorious, holding up parts like trophies. But what you didn't see was the exhaustion behind the smiles, the missed family dinners, or the times when the factory's relentless pace meant you had no time to catch your breath. There was also the pressure to outperform. Production quotas increased constantly, because the war never slowed down, and neither did the factories. If you fell behind, you risked being labelled not doing your part, which was basically a social death sentence in a community glued together by shared sacrifice. The government and companies sometimes threw patriotic bonuses or awards your way, but these were more like crumbs on the floor. They didn't fix the broken machines, the fatigue or the aching joints. So yes, you were helping the war effort, and that was important, inspiring, and sometimes downright heroic. But don't be fooled into thinking it was glamorous or easy. It was hard, exhausting, sometimes terrifying work that demanded every ounce of your strength. And the only medals you earned were calloused hands and stories you'd never forget. Because in the end, patriotism was the spark, but reality was the grind. So here you are, covered in grime, hands trembling from the endless grind, lunch eaten in 5 minutes flat, feet aching in socks that are basically ancient torture devices. And yet, you kept going. Why? Because despite all the aches, exhaustion, and questionable cafeteria food, you were part of something enormous. You weren't on the front lines dodging bullets, but without you, the bullets wouldn't have existed. You weren't storming beaches, but you built the boats that carried the brave men and women who did. Your thankless job kept the gears of a massive war machine running smoothly. And that's no small thing. History often remembers generals, presidents, and famous battles, but history owes a debt to the factory workers whose sweat and toil built the weapons that shaped the outcome of World War II. Yes, it sucked. It was exhausting, dangerous, and sometimes downright miserable. But that's the paradox of the wartime factory worker's life. The harder it was, the more crucial it became. So next time you think about heroes in World War II, don't just picture the soldiers. You might want to picture the factory workers too, grimy and tired, turning their shifts into the backbone of victory. Because in the end, the war wasn't just fought on the battlefield, it was fought in every clang of a hammer, every turn of a wrench, and every tired step across a factory floor. And if you think about it, that's pretty heroic, even if it did suck. The Day the Earth Shook. Real historical natural disasters that changed everything, Part 1. When the gods sneezed, Pompeii, 79 AD. Imagine waking up in your charming Roman villa, brushing ash off your breakfast loaf, and casually ignoring the fact that your mountain is grumbling. Because hey, Mount Vesuvius always makes that noise. It's just being dramatic again. But on the morning of August 24th, 79 AD, the volcano wasn't crying wolf. It was preparing the ancient equivalent of a tactical nuke. And the people of Pompeii, they had absolutely no idea that their city was about to be turned into a lava-flavored time capsule. Let's set the scene. Pompeii was a thriving Roman resort town for the wealthy and the Instagrammers of their time, minus the phones, plus a lot more togas and suspicious fish sauces. The local elite lounged in their villas, hosted lavish banquets, and discussed philosophy, wine, and occasionally why the ground trembled more often than a nervous chihuahua. The warning signs were there. Earthquakes had been rattling the region for years, but the Romans, being practical and occasionally stubborn, responded with classic denial. Oh, that, just the gods expressing themselves. Nothing a little goat sacrifice can't fix. Then, boom. At around midday, Vesuvius exploded with the fury of 1,000 disgruntled landlords. First came a massive ash cloud, darkening the skies and causing people to yell things like, "This is fine," while not being fine at all. Hot pumice began raining down, collapsing roofs and pelting anyone not smart enough to run. Then came the real horror, pyroclastic flows, essentially avalanches of gas, ash, and rock moving faster than a chariot on espresso. Entire neighborhoods were incinerated in seconds. People, buildings, dogs, and street food vendors all vanished under a cloud of death. And yet, the tragedy came with a historical gift. Pompeii was preserved, not just the bones, but the graffiti, the dishes, the loaves of bread still in ovens. It's one of the most surreal time machines ever discovered. You can walk the streets today and see ancient snack bars, political graffiti, and murals that definitely wouldn't pass Instagram's decency filter. The eruption killed thousands and buried cities, but it also gave us a priceless window into Roman life. It's history's most horrific freeze frame. So what did we learn from Pompeii? Apparently, not much, because humanity has a habit of rebuilding in exactly the same spot where nature says, get out. But don't worry, we're just getting started. Coming up next, a day when the earth shook, the sea roared, and Enlightenment Europe got a wake-up call from a very angry ocean. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755. Part 2. Lisbon, 1755. When the Enlightenment got slammed by a tsunami, it was a bright, cloudless morning on November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. The churches of Lisbon were packed, candles flickered, hymns echoed, the devout prayed, and then the earth made a horrifying counter-argument. At exactly 9:40 a.m., the ground began to tremble. Not a gentle wobble, not a polite warning. This was Earth saying, "Excuse me, I'm just going to rearrange your entire city." The quake lasted somewhere between 6 and 9 minutes, which, in earthquake time, is basically forever. Buildings didn't just collapse, they exploded, as walls pancaked and churches crumbled with unholy enthusiasm. People screamed, the ground split open, statues fell, and the candles. Remember the candles in all those churches ignited fires that would devour everything not crushed by stone. But wait, it gets worse. Because a few minutes after the shaking stopped and survivors staggered into the open air, they noticed something weird. The sea had disappeared. Thousands rushed to the harbour to gawk at the vanishing ocean. Strange, they said. Where did all the water go? Spoiler alert. It came back, in a wall, 60 feet high, at 30 miles per hour. The tsunami slammed into Lisbon with the subtlety of a drunk rhinoceros. Ships were hurled inland. People were dragged out to sea. The fires that hadn't been started by falling debris, now they were raging. Thanks to oil stores, wooden buildings, and one very unhelpful wind, Lisbon was soon consumed in a hellish inferno. The final body count? Tens of thousands, possibly up to 100,000 people. A third of Lisbon was gone. Portugal's glory, its golden architecture, its imperial pride, all reduced to rubble, ash, and soggy wreckage. The psychological fallout was just as massive. Europe was in the middle of the Enlightenment, a time when people believed reason, science, and good manners could explain everything. But how do you reason with a tsunami? The disaster rocked the philosophical world. Voltaire, ever the sarcastic pessimist, famously responded, "This is the best of all possible worlds," in his scathing satire Candide. Meanwhile, some people thought the quake was God's judgment. Others thought it was just very bad urban planning. One Portuguese minister, the Marquis of Pombal, simply rolled up his sleeves and said, "Bury the dead and feed the living." Then he rebuilt Lisbon with wider streets, earthquake-resistant buildings, and zero patience for nonsense. Honestly, the guy was like FEMA and a bulldozer combined. Lisbon was never quite the same, but it rose again, wiser, humbler, and with fewer buildings near the shoreline. So what did we learn? If the ground shakes, don't run into the church. If the ocean disappears, don't go sightseeing. And if the Enlightenment taught us anything, it's that nature doesn't care how smart you think you are. It will still drop a flaming bell tower on your philosophical treatise. Part 3, Krakatoa, 1883. The day the world heard a volcano scream. If Earth had a sound effects department, Krakatoa was the day it cranked the dial to shatter your eardrums in multiple continents. It all began on a peaceful August morning in 1883, off the coast of what is now Indonesia. The island of Krakatoa had been rumbling like a hungry stomach for months, letting out puffs of smoke, and giving the locals what geologists technically call a very bad feeling. Then, on August 27th, the mountain exploded. Not like, boom, and it's done. No, this was more like, buff. And more, booms. And then the sky turned into Satan's smoke machine. The eruption was 4 times more powerful than the largest nuclear bomb ever detonated. Let that sink in. The blast was so loud it was heard over 3,000 miles away. People in Australia and Mauritius thought war had broken out. In Rwanda, locals reportedly thought the noise was the angry gods of the volcanoes getting into a shouting match. Meanwhile, barometers in London jumped like a Victorian butler discovering jazz. About 2/3 of the island literally disappeared. Just gone, yeeted into the atmosphere at my holy crap. But Krakatoa wasn't finished. The real killer came in the form of tsunamis, some of which reached heights of over 100 feet. These waves didn't just slap the coast, they erased villages, towns, and tens of thousands of lives. Over 36,000 people were killed, many of them swept away as the sea decided to briefly become an aggressive landlord, reclaiming property. The sky, meanwhile, turned into a surrealist painting. Ash and gas rose into the stratosphere, wrapping the earth in a smoky blanket. For months, sunsets around the globe glowed blood red and orange, like the world was trapped inside a lava lamp. Painters in Europe went nuts. Poets wrote moody verses, and people in New York thought the apocalypse had arrived, but politely waited to confirm it in tomorrow's paper. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 1.2 degrees Celsius. Harvests failed. Climate patterns went haywire. It was like the earth got a cold and forgot to warn the rest of us. The eruption also inspired literature, conspiracy theories, and yes, even horror stories. Some even say it influenced Edvard Munch's painting The Scream. Honestly, it makes sense. If you saw the sun glowing like a radioactive grapefruit every evening for weeks, you'd scream too. And Krakatoa didn't go quietly into that dark night. The volcanic child it birthed, Anak Krakatau, or Child of Krakatoa, still exists today. It occasionally burps lava and reminds everyone that yes, volcanoes hold grudges. So what did we learn? If your island starts shaking, smoking, and sounding like it's summoning demons, leave immediately. If the sea pulls back, don't follow it. If your sunset looks like it was painted by a pyromaniac, maybe don't go on a picnic. Also, maybe don't build your village next to a volcano that's been historically described as the one that obliterated part of the sky. Part 4. The Year Without a Summer. When the sky forgot how to work, 1816. Imagine it's June. You plant your crops, the birds are singing, your goats are being weird, but that's normal. And then, overnight, it snows. Not just a freak flurry, not a quaint little dusting. We're talking hard freezes in June, July, and August. Crops wither, rivers ice over. People begin to look nervously at the family cow like it might be dinner in a coat. Welcome to 1816, a year so weird, so broken, so cold, it got nicknamed the Year Without a Summer. And this wasn't a localized issue, no. This was global cold confusion. New England? Frozen. China? Flooded. Switzerland? Starving. Indonesia? Still smouldering. Because the culprit behind all this chilly chaos wasn't winter. It was a volcano. Let's rewind just a bit, to April 1815, when Mount Tambora in Indonesia decided to one-up Krakatoa by doing its best impression of a cosmic sneeze. Tambora erupted with such unholy force that it basically removed the top third of the mountain. An estimated 12 cubic miles of rock and ash were hurled into the sky, which is about the same as taking all of Manhattan, grinding it into dust, and flinging it into orbit. The eruption killed over 70,000 people, but its effects didn't stop at Indonesia's shores. The ash reached the stratosphere, where it did what all evil villains do. It blocked the sun. This ash cloud wrapped around the globe like a passive-aggressive smoke curtain, filtering sunlight and cooling the planet. Not dramatically, mind you, just by a couple degrees Celsius. But that was enough to wreck entire ecosystems. In Europe, crops failed. Wheat became a luxury item. Riots broke out over the price of oats. And if you were a horse, bad news. Oats were now more expensive than silver, and people started eating you. In New England, there were actual blizzards in June. Farmers were baffled. People wore winter coats in July. Ice formed on lakes in August. Entire harvests failed, and desperate families migrated westward in search of less cursed farmland. In India, the monsoons went berserk, leading to flooding and cholera outbreaks that would kill hundreds of thousands. Because apparently if the world's ending, it likes to include bonus diseases. And in the middle of all this doom and gloom, Lord Byron rented a villa in Switzerland. Stranded indoors thanks to the cold and fog, he and his buddies, including a young woman named Mary Shelley, sat around, read ghost stories, and dared each other to write something terrifying. The result? Frankenstein. That's right. The Year Without a Summer is partly to blame for Frankenstein's monster, and probably half of Hot Topic's product line. So what did we learn? If a volcano erupts on the other side of the world, yes, it can still ruin your picnic. If it snows in June, you're not in a quirky Christmas movie. You're in a historic catastrophe. And if the sun goes dim, don't assume it's just vibes. Maybe check in with the nearest geologist. Also, thank volcanoes the next time you enjoy dystopian literature. Without global climate chaos, Mary Shelley might have written a romantic comedy instead, and Frankenstein would have been a misunderstood barista with a poetry blog. Part 5. The 1556 Shanxi Earthquake. When the ground opened up and history fell, in some disasters whisper, others knock. But the Sherinchi earthquake of 1556, it screamed. In the early morning hours of January 23rd, 1556, as most people in northern China were still snuggled in bed, the earth decided it had had enough of staying still and unleashed the deadliest earthquake in recorded human history. The land didn't just shake, it broke, collapsed, and in some cases, vanished. This was not your average fault line shuffle. The estimated magnitude was around 8.0, but due to the unique geology and horrifying architecture of the time, the damage went far beyond what that number suggests. Over 830,000 people died, more than any other earthquake, ever. That's not just a record, it's a reminder that nature doesn't care about population density, building codes, or whether your life insurance is up to date. Let's set the scene. In 1556, much of the population in the Shaanxi region lived in something called yaodongs, homes carved directly into clay hillsides. They were cool in summer, warm in winter, and unfortunately, extremely prone to collapsing like a flan in a cupboard, if the earth so much as sneezed. When the quake hit, entire cliff faces disintegrated, villages slid sideways into rivers, the ground split open, swallowing people, animals, homes, and whatever else had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong tectonic time. One ancient account reads like the script of a horror movie. Mountains and rivers changed places, and roads were destroyed. In some places, the ground rose up like a wall. In others, it sank into a deep chasm. Translation: nature turned into a terrible interior designer and redecorated with landslides and despair. Fires broke out, wells disappeared, survivors fled to open ground, only to be hit by freezing temperatures. Because if the quake didn't get you, hypothermia was waiting in the wings, like a villain in a second act reveal. And unlike modern disasters, there were no rescue helicopters, no disaster relief, no one handing out bottled water and trauma blankets. If your yaodong caved in, and your family got buried inside, the only thing you could do was dig with your hands and pray the mountain didn't fall on you again. Records from the Ming Dynasty describe a 10-day night, as dust and smoke hung in the air, turning day into dusk. People thought the gods were angry, which honestly, fair. But as catastrophic as it was, the Shaanxi earthquake taught later Chinese dynasties a vital lesson. Don't build your home into something that behaves like pudding under pressure. Eventually, there were moves toward more stable architectural styles, not because of regulations, mind you, because terrifying memory tends to stick. So what did we learn? If your house is technically part of a hillside, double check it's not also your tomb. Clay is not a structural material, it is what toddlers eat when no one's watching. And if the ground moves, and your village ends up in a river, it's okay to panic. Historically, that's what everyone else did. Part 6. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake, when Chile sneezed and the whole Pacific caught a cold. If you thought the Shaanxi earthquake was intense, buckle up, because this one doesn't just break records, it picks up the record book, tears it in half, and throws it into the ocean. On May 22nd, 1960, in the middle of a quiet Sunday afternoon, Chile experienced something so enormous, so violently unhinged, that scientists still talk about it like it's an urban legend. But it's not, it's real, and it has a name. The Great Chilean Earthquake, or, if you're into numbers, a magnitude 9.5. Let's pause for a second. That's not just big, that's the most powerful earthquake ever recorded on Earth. That's you can hear it from space, energy. That's your bathtub starts sloshing, even though you're on another continent. Levels of absurd. The epicenter was near the city of Valdivia, and the quake lasted for over 10 minutes. Yes, 10 full minutes of the ground rolling, shaking, buckling, and just generally behaving like it was tired of holding still. If you've ever tried standing during a 30-second earthquake, imagine that. But you live in a blender now. Houses, gone. Roads, shattered. Bridges, more like suggestions. People, panicking in all directions. In total, over 2 million people were affected, with roughly 1,600 confirmed dead, 3,000 injured, and over 2 million left homeless. Entire towns were flattened, and the land itself changed shape. Rivers shifted, coastline sank, and some parts of Chile literally moved over 30 feet westward. But wait, there's more, because like all terrible gifts from the earth, This one came with accessories. A 75-foot tsunami, which slammed into the Chilean coast, like Poseidon was having a tantrum. So tsunamis that crossed the Pacific Ocean, hitting Hawaii, Japan, the Philippines, New Zealand, and even California, because apparently the Pacific Ocean is just one big earthquake group chat. A volcanic eruption. Yes, just to add spice. The nearby Cordon Col volcano erupted 2 days later, as if to say, oh, are we doing disasters now? Cool, I'll join. In Japan, 15,000 kilometers away, 138 people were killed by a tsunami that began in Chile. That's not just a long-distance wave, that's an international incident caused by seafloor level rage. And to make matters more poetic, the tsunami reached the Antarctic research base, where scientists must have looked up from their ice studies and gone, I beg your what? Economically, the damage was staggering. Over $550 million in 1960 dollars, which in modern terms translates to more money than you want to think about. The Chilean government was devastated, but also kind of shrugged like, well, that's the Ring of Fire for you. Oh yes, the Ring of Fire. It's not just a Johnny Cash song, it's the volatile arc of seismic chaos that stretches around the Pacific Ocean, including Chile, Japan, California, and basically anyone who thought beach living sounded peaceful. So what did we learn? If the ground starts moving and doesn't stop for 10 minutes, it's not a dance party, it's a continental shift. The ocean is not your friend. It holds grudges and sends tsunamis to places that didn't even RSVP. And if your volcano decides to erupt during your earthquake recovery, you're living in a deleted scene from a disaster movie. Part 7. The 1970 Bola cyclone. When the wind came for a country and took 500,000 lives. If earthquakes are nature's way of saying, stay alert, hurricanes are its way of saying, you should have moved inland when you had the chance. On November 12, 1970, the skies over the Bay of Bengal darkened, the ocean began to boil, and the world got a front row seat to the deadliest tropical cyclone in human history, the Bola cyclone. Now cyclones hit this part of the world all the time. It's almost a seasonal hobby. But this one was different. It didn't just pass through, it erased, it drowned. It wiped the chalkboard of life clean in some of the most densely populated, poorest parts of what was then East Pakistan, now known as Bangladesh. Let's talk stats, because they're horrifying. Wind speeds hit 115 miles per hour, 185 kilometers per h. A 30-foot storm surge swept across the low-lying islands and coastlines, and somewhere between 300,000 to 500,000 people were killed. That's not a typo. That's a city's worth of humanity gone in a single night. You might be wondering, how does a storm kill that many people? Well, imagine your country as a giant flat swamp with millions of people living on tiny islands barely above sea level. Then add a massive cyclone churning the ocean into a vertical wall of salt water and tossing it on shore like a furious god flipping over the world's worst kiddie pool. Villages vanished, boats splintered like toothpicks, fields were buried in brine, and survivors woke up on rooftops, or not at all. But here's where the disaster got political. The Pakistani government, based in West Pakistan, modern-day Pakistan, on the other side of India, responded with the enthusiasm of a teenager asked to clean their room, late, begrudgingly, and terribly. Aid was slow, uncoordinated, and in many areas, non-existent. International journalists arrived before the military. Relief supplies rotted in warehouses. Helicopters flew over drowned villages without stopping, like lost pizza delivery drivers. People didn't just die from the storm, they died from being ignored. This wasn't just a weather event, it was a tipping point. Public outrage exploded. Political movements surged, and by the next year, civil war had broken out. The Bola cyclone didn't just devastate the land, it helped ignite the Bangladesh Liberation War, a brutal conflict that led to the birth of a new nation. So yes, a hurricane helped redraw the map. Some dark humor here? Sure. If you lived in Bola in 1970, your weather report was basically, tomorrow, humid, with a chance of apocalypse. If your house had walls, a roof, and a floor, congratulations, you were part of the 1%. And when survivors asked, where's the government? The answer was usually missing, confused, or enjoying tea in Islamabad. So what did we learn? Geography matters, but so does governance. When you live in a delta built by rivers and karma, build tall houses, and stronger institutions. And if your leader responds to a humanitarian disaster with paperwork and apathy, it's probably time for a revolution, or at least a really angry crowd with signs. Part 8. Mount Pelée, 1902. The volcano that killed a city and forgot one guy in jail. If natural disasters had an award show, this one would win Best Dramatic Irony and Most Theatrical Exit by a City. Welcome to Saint-Pierre, Martinique, 1902. A place so picturesque, so vibrant, so French, that it was nicknamed the Paris of the Caribbean. It had it all. Colonial mansions, busy markets, bougainvillea, dripping from balconies, and about 30,000 people who had absolutely no idea they were living next to a ticking geological time bomb called Mount Pelée. Spoiler alert, things go very, very badly. The setup. It's May, 1902. The French colony is gearing up for elections, the cafes are full, and sugar is booming. Sure, the mountain had been acting a little weird, rumbling, steaming, and letting off the occasional puff of ash. But nothing serious, right? You know, just volcano things. Some folks started getting nervous. Animals ran for the hills. Even the snakes were like, nope, we're out. But the local authorities told everyone to relax. There was even a newspaper headline that basically said, "The volcano is harmless. Please continue shopping." And why wouldn't they believe it? Scientists came, sniffed the smoke, shrugged, and left. The governor stayed put. Saint-Pierre was safe, at least until May 8th, when Mount Pelée decided, none. The blast. At 7:52 a.m., Mount Pelée exploded, not with lava, but with a pyroclastic surge. That's a fancy way of saying a 1000-degree cloud of ash, gas, and death traveling faster than a bullet train. It wasn't a gentle eruption. It wasn't something you could outrun. It was more like a dragon exhaling an entire city into oblivion. In less than 2 minutes, Saint-Pierre was gone. People didn't have time to scream. Horses dropped mid-gallop. Glass liquefied in shop windows. Church bells melted. Some were vaporized where they stood, while others were turned into stone statues of themselves in ash. Out of 30,000 people, exactly one person survived the direct blast. Let's meet him. The guy who lived, his name was Ludger Silbaris, and he survived because, wait for it, he was locked in a solitary jail cell. That's right. This man survived the worst volcanic eruption in the Western Hemisphere because he had been arrested the night before for drunk and disorderly conduct. His cell was small, thick-walled, poorly ventilated, and probably smelled like regret. And on May 8th, that miserable little stone room became a literal lifesaver. The heat seared him, the air burned his lungs, but he lived badly scorched, barely breathing, but alive. He was later pardoned, because survived volcano looks great on a resume, and went on to tour with the Barnum and Bailey Circus as the man who lived through doomsday. You can't make this stuff up. The aftermath. So what did the world learn? Never ignore rumbling mountains. When snakes flee a city, follow them. And sometimes the safest place to be is jail. And yes, there were warnings. There were signs. There were scientists. But like in so many disasters, the need to preserve normal won out over common sense, and a city paid the ultimate price. Let's recap. Death toll 29,999. Survivors 1. Lessons. Don't trust a steaming mountain. Don't downplay nature. And if you ever find yourself drunk and thrown in jail on a Caribbean island, stay there. Part 9. The 1931 Yangtze River floods, when China got soaked like never before or since. If you ever thought your rainy day was rough, imagine a flood so vast it could swallow a dozen countries and still have room left for some angry fish. Welcome to China. 1931, where the Yangtze, Huai, and Yellow Rivers teamed up to make history by flooding more land than all the other floods combined in the last century. Basically, it was the Titanic of floods, but without the iceberg and with way more mud. How did this happen? Well, nature threw a perfect storm or a perfect rain of catastrophic proportions. The winter of 1930 to 31 saw record snowfall in the river basins. Come spring, the snow melted rapidly. Then the summer monsoon showed up and said, "Hold my umbrella," dumping months' worth of rain in weeks. The rivers, already swollen, had no choice but to spill over their banks, and spill they did, with a vengeance. What was flooded? Over 70,000 square kilometers of farmland. That's about the size of Ireland, disappeared underwater. Some reports say the floodwaters stretched over 600 miles long and 300 miles wide in parts. Millions of people were forced to flee homes, villages, and fields. This wasn't just a flood. It was like someone hit the submerge button on the entire eastern half of China. The human cost, hold on to your hats, between 1 million and 4 million people died, depending on whose records you trust. The deaths weren't just from drowning, though plenty did, but from starvation, disease, and exposure that followed. Imagine this: whole communities wiped out, crops ruined, livestock drowned, water supplies contaminated, and diseases like cholera and typhoid spreading faster than gossip at a family reunion. And the rescue efforts? Well, let's just say they were about as organized as a group chat with 100 people all typing at once. But wait, there's more. The government was already weak, dealing with internal strife and political instability. Aid was slow, insufficient, and often corrupted. Refugees packed into makeshift camps where hygiene was non-existent, making disease outbreaks inevitable. And because this was before satellite photos and viral videos, much of the world didn't even realize how bad it was until months later. The dark humor of floodings. When your whole province looks like a giant swimming pool, houseboat takes on a whole new meaning. Fish were reportedly swimming through the streets. If you wanted sushi, you just opened your front door. And if you thought dealing with traffic was bad, try navigating a city where the roads are underwater and the only taxis are canoes. Lessons learned. Eventually, flood management and dam construction became national priorities. The disaster helped spur modernization in China's infrastructure and emergency response, albeit slowly, and it showed the world just how devastating nature can be when rivers get a little too enthusiastic. Part 10. Krakatoa, 1883. The volcano that blew its top so hard it was heard halfway around the world. Imagine a volcano with the personality of a rock star, dramatic, loud, and impossible to ignore. Enter Krakatoa, a volcanic island in Indonesia that decided to put on a show in August 1883. And the earth just couldn't handle it, the calm before the loudest storm. For months, Krakatoa had been grumbling, more like a grouchy old man clearing his throat than a volcano about to go supernova. Then, on August 26th, things started to get serious. Explosions rattled windows hundreds of miles away, lightning cracked through ash clouds, and people were like, maybe we should get out of here. But spoiler alert, most didn't. The blast heard around the world. On August 27th, Krakatoa decided to blow its top. Literally, the main explosion was so powerful that it was heard up to 3,000 miles away. For perspective, that's like hearing a fart in New York, all the way in Los Angeles. If farts could level towns, the pressure wave from the blast circled the Earth 7 times. That's some serious planetary echo. The island itself was obliterated, reduced to a third of its original size. This wasn't just a volcano going boom. It was the Earth sending a very loud, fiery, and smoky, "I'm mad" text. The aftermath: tsunamis, ash, and global weather chaos. The explosion triggered massive tsunamis that swept across the Sunda Strait, wiping out over 36,000 people in coastal towns. But the chaos didn't stop there. The atmosphere filled with volcanic ash, creating sunsets so spectacular they inspired artists worldwide. Global temperatures dropped by over 1 degree Celsius for years. Yes, a volcano gave Earth a volcanic cold snap. Mother Nature's way of saying, hold my ash. The eerie volcanic winter caused crop failures and strange weather around the globe. Dark humor from the ashes. If you thought your neighbor's barbecue was smoky, Krakatoa took it to a whole new level. The sky turned so red that people called it the year without a proper sunset. Party pooper, much. And if you complained about noise pollution, try telling that to the people who heard Krakatoa's blast while having breakfast 3,000 miles away. What did we learn? Volcanoes can blow your plans and your island sky high. Mother Nature doesn't do subtle, and if the Earth sends you a message that loud, maybe it's time to listen or just move somewhere without a volcano.